Okay, so we're going to have a free-flowing conversation. What I think would be nice for my viewers watching in the Netherlands and perhaps outside of it, maybe you just want to introduce yourself and your ideas, and then I can introduce my ideas, and then we'll see, what's going to be interesting to discuss.
Yeah, sure. I'm Mouthy Infidel. I have a YouTube channel. I'm basically a democratic socialist, I guess you could call me, or a socialist. Um, yeah, I guess that about sums it up.
Well, for the viewers who don't know me, who are watching this video, my name is Yernaz Ramautarsing, and I'm a defender of objectivism, an adherent to Ayn Rand's philosophy. So I'm a radical for capitalism. So I think this should be an interesting conversation. Uh, if you could point at the weakest uh, argument for capitalism, which one would you pick out?
Like the weakest argument people make,
Used by
like in
people who
favor of
promote, yeah, used by people who promote capitalism.
um I don't know. That's a good question. I guess in terms of the weakest one, I think like a lot of the I think a lot of the almost like deontological arguments from like the lack of coercion are really bad. I don't find those very convincing. Um, yeah, I guess it's a tough one. There's a lot of arguments for capitalism that I've dealt with. So
Yeah, because I saw you make that point in one of your earlier videos where you said that freedom is to be free of the need for healthcare, right? And you
mm,
listed some other stuff, if I remember
yeah,
correctly.
yeah, I think freedom is generally defined as the ability to live one's life without hindrance or constraint. um Not only is this like the just sort of like the dictionary definition that people generally use, but I think this is like the only definition of freedom that's intrinsically worth caring about. Like one example that I like to give is like if you walk up to like a say like a homeless person who's like living on a street and like dying from lack of healthcare, I don't think this person would necessarily care whether or not the reason he can't live his life is due to like some government coercion or due to just his lack of ability to pay for the necessities of life. I don't think this really makes a difference to people. So yeah, I think like providing people healthcare, providing people the ability to live, to make a living wage, providing people the ability to earn some base level of subsistence. I think these things are very important for allowing people to live their lives as they see fit, without constraint.
Yeah, okay. Well, because so if you would take the definition, freedom is the absence of force, why would you not accept that definition? Because it's one Ayn Rand uses, but I'm just curious what you would respond to. If someone
Yeah,
would
so
define freedom that way, let's say political freedom, maybe to be more
yeah,
narrow, political
sure.
freedom.
So okay, so I would generally say like freedom and political freedom, I would both just consider these things the ability to like I guess again like the ability to do what you want to do, right? Just the ability to do that. um and I think that defining it as just the lack of force is
Mhm.
maybe a bit I think that's a bit like reductive, because I think people can suffer from a lack of freedom without the absence of some government coercion. So like let's say someone is born disabled, they're so disabled that they can't earn a market income, they can't get a job.
Mhm.
And this person essentially has no freedom to do anything with their life because they can't earn any money. In a completely free market like capitalist society, they basically don't have any options other than to just like live out on the street and suffer. I think this is a life which is fundamentally characterized by an utter lack of freedom. Like you can't do anything you want to do in your life, you're not free. But in the same sense, this is a lack of freedom that's created by a lack of I guess economic distribution, or a certain economic distribution, rather than a lack of freedom which was been created by some I guess government like coercion or policy.
Okay, but what if I wanted to separate those two areas? What if I would say, listen, we all deserve political freedom. That just means the government can't, kick your ass, throw you in
Mhm.
jail for whatever reason. We all love that, right? So let's start there. And then if you see stuff that you don't like a homeless person on the street, you're totally free to help them in whatever capacity you want. Like, I would never stop you from helping people or giving people food or providing stuff for people. Like, that's all up to you. I'm just talking about, can we have a society where we guarantee the political freedom? And then if we have social issues, we can solve them in the realm of the social sphere without politics, without politicians interfering, without taxation. We can discuss it, battle of ideas, etc., etc.
Mhm.
Would you think that's a reasonable offer?
So I would disagree with that because so one of the points that I don't know if you saw my videos on your friend Yaron Brook.
I saw them both. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the points that I generally make is if you look across countries that have like more social programs, more welfare, tend to have a lot less poverty. Countries, even within countries, like post-tax and transfer income or post-tax and transfer poverty is very much higher or is very much lower than pre-tax and transfer poverty. And so we can see that like having taxpayer funded, coerced sort of welfare policies does eliminate poverty to a very substantial degree. However, if you look at a graph of countries, I presented this graph in a video I made on welfare. If you look at a graph of poverty rate and how it correlates by private social spending, i.e. charity, there's basically no discernible correlation between relative levels of charity and a lack of poverty. I think this is just fundamentally because it's largely like a collective action problem. Like if people aren't being necessarily like coerced into, taxes, which then go to certain social programs, there's just not enough funding for these social programs to like eliminate poverty to any substantial degree. Yeah, so I generally think like I know what you would kind of say is like the taxes themselves are immoral. I generally would like to weigh like the different outcomes. Like, sure, we might not like the idea that people are being forced to pay taxes, but I dislike the idea that people should be dying en masse because they can't afford healthcare more than I dislike the idea of people being forced to pay taxes. So
okay, so are you saying it's picking between two evils, the lesser, or is that not how you would promote it? Like,
yeah,
are you
it's
taking
just
the lesser of two evils, or are you not using that formulation?
whether or not you want to call it an evil, I think we're picking between two outcomes. We're fundamentally saying which outcome is less desirable, which outcome would be less like to see. And personally, I would less like to see, thousands of children starving, people who are disabled not being able to make a living, people who are, like elderly poverty being in like the, skyrocketing. I would less like to see these things than I would
Okay.
just people being forced to pay
Yeah,
taxes to fund
fair
social
enough. Okay.
programs. Yeah.
I've heard a couple of interesting things. So the first topic would be the charity topic. Listen,
Mhm.
the position of the capitalist is quite difficult because I have to present something that does not exist. It's always hard, right? You
Mhm.
have a certain thing you can point to. You can point to government policy and say, listen, we gave X amount of people this amount of money. There's no poverty according to the books. I don't have that. But that's where Bastiat came in with his theory of the seen and the unseen, right? So my theory would be that if we would privatize charity, there would be new mechanisms in the charity market. Mechanisms I cannot predict right now with certainty. That's the weakness in the argument. But if you and me are both men of reason, I think you can come with me in this imagination that, let's say, we would have a free market of charity. I can imagine that someone would start a charity who maybe had a bad father and said, you know what, I'm going to raise money for kids who had bad fathers. And he's going to have like these criteria on his website, and people can check into it, and he's going to be privately accountable for if he messes with the money. Couldn't you get along with the idea that that might be way more effective in fighting, for instance, children suffering from having a bad father in this particular case? Because you would have someone who is personally involved, not a government, bureaucrat. His reputation is on the line. He's way more accountable than like a big organization. He's not going to take hundreds of thousands of salary like most people in the Netherlands at least do with these public-private charities. So if you look at it from that perspective, couldn't you see how we might stop more, for instance, poverty in that way?
It is of course possible that this, could be the case. The issue that I'm having is that while we haven't ever seen like a perfect example of what you would consider to be like a, libertarian free market
Hmm.
society, we do have some societies which have more social spending, some
True.
societies which have less social spending, some societies which have larger and smaller governments. And what we've seen, based on these cross-country comparisons, is that countries which have less government and which try more to rely on private charity, that you're suggesting to alleviate poverty, tend to not be able to alleviate poverty to any substantial degree, and don't come anywhere near a good welfare state in terms of alleviating poverty and smoothing out poverty gap and so on. um
Yeah,
so
but
yeah, I would just
but
say
that is,
like
yeah,
mhm.
but that is
Yeah.
based on the current number. So, and I get it. Like, I agree. I recognize it. That's the hard part of my argument, because you can base it off what is happening now. But in my idea, obviously, if you would have a free market, there would be more wealth generated, less people would be unemployed. So the poverty you would have to fight would be less in nature. The technology would be way more innovative. Like, we would be like 20 years ahead if we would have a free market, perhaps. Like, if you have to take into account those aspects as well. Otherwise, you're right, you could just point at the current numbers and be like, well, it's not that great of an effect. But yeah, that's the difficulty of the seen and the unseen, and the government is peddling in the seen and we never see the unseen. So that is why I'm so for capitalism, because I really see that side of human beings. Like, I actually think that in a free market, if you're less taxed, you're going to be more critical of the money you're going to spend on charities, but you're going to give with a heart. You're going to give with real intention. You're going to be really looking into the money, right? It's going to be way better than some government program promising to stop poverty and like giving kids free school lunches, right? Like,
Mhm.
10% of the kids don't have school lunch. That's terrible. Now we're going to give 100% of the kids school lunches because
Mhm.
we don't want the 10% to suffer. Like,
Yeah,
you, that can never be more effective than what I'm proposing.
sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, so there's a few points there that I would probably make. So you make a point how in a free market society there would be less unemployment. And I could grant, for the sake of argument that, this is true. But what I would say there is that if we actually look at, the reasons why poverty exists, by
Hmm.
and large, it's not because there's not enough jobs. If we look at the people who make up most of the people in poverty, mostly it is disabled people, it's elderly people, it's children, it's caretakers who are taking care of like, maybe a sick family member, a
Yeah, I
disabled family
understand. Yeah.
member. Yeah, it's students who are going to college, obviously. And so the problem isn't that there's not enough jobs. The problem is that market incomes don't distribute any money to these people who I would argue shouldn't be working, right? Because these people have like other things. Old
Hmm.
people are obviously too old to work. I wouldn't expect someone who's like, disabled to work. So the problem isn't that, people don't have enough jobs. The problem is that there are certain groups of people in society who don't work, who shouldn't work, and therefore market society doesn't, distribute them any income, because obviously a market society only distributes income based on factor productivity, that being, how much capital you own and how much you work. Um, you talked about how there would be like more wealth in a more free market capitalist society. Again, I mean, we could quabble about that, but I would say the more fundamental objection that I would make is, even if I were to grant that, I think the problem is, even if people have more wealth, we've seen that people aren't so much incentivized to spend that wealth towards like social spending without some sort of coercive element. um, as far as like the sort of the broader point that there's like no examples that you could point to, but I would I would like agree, of course, that there are no examples that like perfectly encapsulate like
Hmm.
what you're talking about. But again, like I think like what we've seen is that the further we go in the direction of social spending, the more we're able to alleviate poverty. And the further we go in the direction of just trying to rely completely on private charity, the less we see that we're able to alleviate poverty. This is sort of like the crowding out effect. So like one argument that I think you're almost alluding to is the argument that if people aren't being taxed as much, like in a sense, like social spending sort of crowds out private spending.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if we were to get rid of social spending, then there would be more private spending to compensate for that. But if that were true, obviously we would see that when we compare societies which have more and less social spending, we would expect poverty to be about as low in either one of them, or even lower in the private charity places. But we see that places with less social spending continually have higher rates of poverty. So I don't see any reason to believe that sort of getting rid of social spending would lead to these alternatives of private charity addressing the same problem. I just think fundamentally it's an incentive thing. Like if we have taxes, you are making sure that we are taking money from everyone who is earning an income and giving it to people who need it. Whereas if we rely on private charity, we're sort of just relying on people to be like inherently altruistic, and I think that's just going to lead to a lot of people deciding like not to do that. Especially because it's just so easy for people to morally detach themselves from what's happening to other people, and in terms of like not wanting to pay for charity. Yeah.
Like I can maybe agree with the detachment to other people, but not if we're talking about like your parents, right? Like if we would
Yeah.
live in a society where the government would not say we're going to take care of your parents, you don't think it's going to be an incentive for people to find insurance companies that they can pay some money to take care of their parents? You don't think that's going to be like number one on everyone's list to do if the government doesn't do it? Like you can draw these comparisons out to like childcare, right? If the
Mhm.
government doesn't tell you we're going to take care of childcare, you're not going to forget about it. You're not going to not take care of your child. You're going to find a solution. Like that's how people are. We solve stuff. So
Yeah.
I don't see how you can really discount that argument. Like,
Yeah. So what I would say to that is in terms of, taking care of like family members, I would agree, like people generally do that. But on the other hand, that's in part why what I'm appealing to in terms of like why poverty is so high. So like for example, there's one statistic where essentially if there were no children, poverty would be like cut in half, right? And the reason there's so much poverty, and the reason why there's so many children in poverty, isn't because their parents just say, I'm not going to take care of my children, and then the children are living in poverty. It's because the parents are taking care of their children, but the children aren't contributing anything economically to their parents. So the children are essentially just a massive drain on their parents' resources. And so like, yeah, I would agree with you that I would say like two things. On the one hand, people would try to take care of their elderly parents. They would try to take care of their children, but this would cause a lot of poverty, because if you're taking care of someone who's not contributing anything, obviously this is going to cause a lot of poverty. And I don't think people should be having to live in poverty because they want to take care of their children or their parents. And the other thing is, this would sort of, just relying on this would sort of leave out a lot of people who maybe don't have like family members that care for them. Like I know this argument wouldn't have much effect on you if you're a conservative, but I assume since you're a libertarian, you might be a bit more receptive to this. But think of like maybe like an LGBT child, and their parents like disown them because they're gay. Who's going to take care of them in that instance? So yeah, I
this
just think
would,
this is like a
yeah,
suboptimal. Yeah.
I think this would be an amazing like example of where private charity would go to. Like this example, like a LGBT kid being left out on the streets by his terrible parents. Like I know that's not what you meant to say, but like
Mhm.
that kid would probably get money in our current society, right? Like
Yeah,
crowdfunding and
maybe.
stuff. Like I think
Mhm.
the people who are more at risk are like the drug dealers who are 60 years old, because it's
Sure.
like, why would we invest in fixing them? We rather fix a 20-year-old drug addict. So I
Mm.
think like in my system of private charity, there would still be groups that would be left without, like people who use violence, like sex offenders, pedosexuals, whatever. Like I don't think people are going to put up a lot of money to take care of those people. Like I agree
Mhm.
with you on that, but I think like the LGBT kid, the orphans, like I just really don't see how they're going to be the ones left out. So like
Yeah.
maybe I'll tell you
It's
something about how
mhm,
Ayn Rand like connects morality to capitalism, because
mhm,
I think the way she tackles it is very different from most conservatives or even libertarians, because she
mhm,
disagreed with Murray Rothbard wholeheartedly on this point. Her point is that capitalism is a moral system, but she doesn't say that the wealth generated by capitalism makes it moral. So she's not saying the fact that capitalism makes us rich means it's a good thing. Like, she would defend capitalism if it would make us poor if it was moral. So that's like, I think that's an interesting thing for us maybe to discuss, because
mm.
sometimes with your arguments, I'm questioning, are you appealing to morality or are you appealing to facts?
Okay.
Because like, because you say some things like, we could take all the wealth and like redistribute it and no one would be poor. But if I would give you that same example when it comes to, we could divide all the women in the world and give them all to a guy who wants to have sex, like, we would both say, what the hell, right? Like,
Hmm.
we would totally denounce that. But
Yeah.
it would solve the problem of guys not having sex. If you think guys not having sex is a really serious problem, if you think it causes violence and school shooters, you know,
Hmm.
you get what I'm saying? Maybe you'd like to
Sure.
respond.
Yeah. So I guess like a couple points that I'd make. I guess just on the I guess this is the last thing we'll say about the thing we were appealing to earlier before
Yeah.
getting into morality. In terms of like the LGBT kids, I think you're right. Maybe these kinds of kids would be more likely to get assistance than somebody who's maybe like a 60-year-old drug dealer who people would be like less sympathetic towards. The sort of broader argument that I'm appealing to is that it just seems to be the case, factually, that um, these types of people or people in general relying on private charity in countries where there's more private charity but less social spending are going to be a lot less lucky than people who are living in places with more social spending but less charity. It just seems to be like the empirical reality of that. So I'm more comfortable taking care of these sorts of kids with the welfare state than with just hoping that their story is sympathetic enough for people to just see it and decide to donate. um, but in terms of the other argument you were talking about, you're talking about capitalism is moral not because of its distribution.
Yeah.
Sorry, what'd you say?
Yeah,
Oh
because
yeah,
of
you're
its
agreeing.
respect for individual rights. I
Yeah,
should have
yeah.
added that. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I would say to that, I would consider how capitalism distributes things a sort of a moral outcome, right? I do think that like if I see, and maybe this is just like different moral systems,
Mm-hmm.
but if I see like old people, elderly poverty, people dying because they can't afford healthcare, children living in poverty in mass, I think these are immoral outcomes. I would fundamentally consider these immoral outcomes. Generally, like my moral system is I want to prevent as much human suffering as possible. And so, if we have an economic system that is allowing extreme amounts of preventable human suffering, I would consider that immoral. And I would even consider it immoral from like an objectivist, Ayn Rand perspective, because I think like Ayn Rand's general philosophy. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure you know more about this than I do,
Yeah, I
but
do.
I would generally consider like Ayn Rand's general position is that people should be able to maximize their own selfish individual desires as much as possible. And I think people being able to like, let me give you an example. Say you are a fast food worker who wants to, criticize the government. Say it's a libertarian and they want to criticize the government for, or they want to criticize their company because of how the government props it up with subsidies and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But because this person lives in a country where they don't have, say, universal health care, they're not able to criticize their company because they're afraid of losing their job and therefore losing their health care. I think this is just like one example I thought might, appeal more to like a libertarian minded person. But I think that in general, what I'm trying to get at is I think having certain like things that are taken care of, like having healthcare be paid for through taxes, having a certain like living wage, having maybe like a UBI or something. I think these things go a long way to allow every individual in society to maximize their own individual desires and how they want to live their life. I have a good example of this actually. There was an interesting study done that talked about how in Denmark, if you look at Denmark's income mobility, like the extent to which people are able to, move up the income ladder throughout their lives, um, post tax and transfer income mobility in Denmark is exactly the same as it is in the US, or pre tax and transfer, sorry. It's exactly the same as it is in the US, but post tax and transfer, after you take into account welfare, income mobility is significantly higher in Denmark than it is in the US. So we know that places with like more welfare and more social spending have higher levels of income mobility. And it's specifically because of their welfare states that they have higher income mobility. And I think income mobility is like fundamentally a great measure of people's ability to maximize their own desires throughout their life. I guess just the final point, just to address the example of, giving people, girlfriends like forcibly. The reason that I would reject that is because, like I said, fundamentally, my moral system is about, minimizing suffering and like minimizing like bad outcomes. And I think that while people having more girlfriends and, men being less lonely is a good outcome, I think that forcing women, taking women's autonomy away, forcing them into these situations, I think the harm that that would cause and the immorality of that outweighs the positive effects of men being less lonely. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not really, so is that a moral argument or is that more a practical argument?
Well, I mean, I think you probably distinguish these two things in a way that I don't.
Okay.
Because
perhaps.
like I would say like my moral system is about minimizing human suffering, allowing people to live the best lives that they can live. And so if we have a system that's preventing people's ability to do that or robbing people of their ability to do that, I like on the net, I would consider that like immoral from my system.
Yeah, okay, but you would allow some suffering to stop
Yes.
more suffering,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so
Generally
in that
speaking.
sense, okay, I would call it practical, but perhaps you're not
Okay.
making
Yeah.
that
Sure.
this
Yeah.
distinction. Okay,
Yeah.
I had a question when you talked about, it's not as bad as people getting taxed to see people, kids on the street dying. Okay, uh, is there a limit? Like, is there a limit to taxation? Is there like some line you won't cross, like taking half of someone's property, or is there like a line that if someone makes over 1 billion, you feel you could take everything over the billion, but not below it? Like, how would you guide me through this? Is there some principle involved?
Yeah. So generally my principle in terms of taxation is like revenue maximization. Like how much money can we get to fund social programs? Now there are certain things called revenue maximizing rates, where if you tax people to a certain extent, they just
It
think
goes down.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like the Laffer curve. Yeah, yeah. Like, if you're going to tax me at 80% of my next dollar, I'm not even going to make a next dollar, and that actually decreases government revenue. I've tried to look for some studies. I've been trying to read more up on like tax policy. I'm not as knowledgeable as I'd like to be, but I've seen like some analyses showing that I think like a top marginal tax rate of somewhere around like 70% is probably like a revenue maximizing rate in that respect. I know some forms of taxes, like a land value tax, for example, doesn't have like any possible deadweight loss. I know that like broadening the tax base so that it's like you're taxing more people allows you to raise the rate at which you're taxing people. So like there's a lot of complexities that go into how specifically to like maximize revenue. But I would say that that's fundamentally my principle, is like taxing as much as possible, getting as much revenue as possible without like diminishing returns.
So are there any barriers? Like, would you take inheritances? Like, is there something that you think, I don't think the government should take the money you want to give to your kid? Is there some moral principle involved there?
Um,
Or haven't you thought
I
about that yet?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. So in terms of like inheritance, I think it's fine to like tax that. Um, because I mean, fundamentally, what you're saying with an inheritance tax is like people who are just born to a rich person shouldn't be like inherently able to just like dominate over like everybody or live like a substantially better life than anyone who's, maybe born to like a working class parent. Funny enough, I could see a very meritocratic argument for an inheritance tax. Like if you care about an economy that rewards based on merit, why should we have a situation where people are getting like an intrinsic massive advantage just because of what their dad accomplished or something? something like that. So yeah, I don't think I have like an intrinsic moral objection to any sorts of or any kind of taxation, as long as it minimizes human suffering, I guess.
Okay, because here again we could talk about the incentives. If I know the inheritance I'm going to give my kid is going to be taxed heavily, obviously I'm going to try to look for ways to avoid that, right? Or maybe I'm not going to
Mm.
work as much, or maybe I'm not going to invest as much money uh, into companies, because
Yeah,
I'm like, yeah, I can leave him 10 million, government's going to take 8. Like, why bother, man?
yeah.
But
I
okay,
mean,
like I get
mhm.
that that's not the point you're making, but
Yeah, yeah.
like it's
I
something to
think like
consider.
there are some taxes that maybe do create malincentives that overall lead to like bad outcomes. I think that's, fine to take into account.
But
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it all just depends on the outcomes for me. Yeah.
okay, a question. So if I would introduce you to a country where they would have a lot of private market and not a lot of government involvement, but there wouldn't be extreme poverty, would you be okay with that? Would you be like, oh well, the one thing I don't like to see, they don't seem to have a lot of, and they get a lot of other freedoms. So like, if I would show you that, you would be fine with it, or you would even advocate for it, or
So there are a few different critiques that I have of capitalism, just besides, like the existence of poverty.
okay.
Um, so like, for example, one issue that I have with capitalism is its inability to like internalize externalities, I guess. Another issue that I would have with capitalism is like sort of like alienation, like people don't have that much influence over the places they work at, which I think is like creates a lot of like undue like human suffering, and like is pretty bad for people's mental health. I think like inequality is a problem, like income inequality, just some people having like massively more than other people. So yeah, I think like there are other things which a free market capitalist society would do that that I think like wouldn't be solved by just solving like the poverty problem. But I do think like one of the issues here is that one of the reasons why I object to capitalism is I don't think that there could be any capitalist, like completely free market capitalist society with basically no social spending that is able to eliminate poverty. I think, one of these, any kind of place that resembles what you're talking about would have, pretty relatively high, rates of poverty, at least, if I'm to, give my interpretation of existing like empirical evidence. Um, one I guess the last thing I would say is like one kind of premise that you talked about there was you know is this would be preferable because if we had no poverty and you also have all of these political rights.
Yeah.
But I don't think that like a free market capitalist society is any more able to have more political rights in terms of like I don't know, like voting or lack of government corruption than a democratic socialist society. In fact, there was an interesting paper called, I think it was called like That's My Money, that basically talks about how there is a continual correlation between the size of government and the size of government spending and like institutional quality and lack of corruption and lack of like terrorism and like all these kinds of things. And the reason, according to the authors, is that if more of people's money is being taxed and held by the government, people are going to pay more attention to what the government does with their money. So in a way, sort of more taxation and more government spending creates like more government, less government corruption and more government accountability and like more institutional quality in the sort of political freedom sense.
I did hear of this argument when it comes to like the Middle Eastern countries who are rich with oil. So I have heard of the variant where they use a lot of the oil money they get to like pay for social programs for their citizens. And because of that agreement, basically, they don't really care about the corruption and the political rights, or don't have like a major focus on it at least. And they allow for themselves to be in a dictatorship. So I think there's also a flip side to that argument.
Yeah. So
Like,
I guess like the specific data that I'm referencing
yeah,
is like so if you look at like the 10 least corrupt countries in the world according to the Transparency International's ranking, so like that's Finland, Denmark, New Zealand, Iceland, Singapore, Sweden, Canada, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the UK. These places, like on average, collect like 23.64% of their GDP in taxes, while the 10 most corrupt countries in the world collectively only have like 14.5% of their GDP in taxes, like at least according to the World Bank. Like even taking the whole world as a sample size, there's like a positive relationship between government size and institutional quality. The correlation between like total tax revenues as a share of GDP and institutional quality is 0.34, and the correlation between total government consumption as a share of GDP and institutional quality is like 0.39. So like this holds in like if you look at specifically in regions in like sub-Saharan Africa, this holds if you look at like central government expenditure. So it seems like in general across the world, places with like more government spending and like larger governments have less government corruption.
But
Yeah.
I would have the counter argument that I think this is more of a cultural issue. I would say that societies that have really messed up governments usually don't have an amazing culture behind it. So you cannot be surprised that there's more corruption there because the culture wasn't great to begin with. But societies that can afford to have big governments, usually because they also have big markets, yeah, they're at the level where corruption, like it ruins your reputation. I don't know, you can't get a date. Like there are a lot of consequences to being corrupt. While if you live in a country where the culture is totally messed up and people are stabbing each other in the back, who the hell cares if you're corrupt? Like maybe you should be corrupt to survive. Maybe it's a good thing to be corrupt. So
Yeah.
I don't know, man. Like I think that's really like a cultural issue. Like for instance, take the Netherlands and Italy, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
we've usually have had a balanced budget in the Netherlands most of the years. Italy almost never had. Like it hasn't changed the last 50, 60 years. So there has to be something about Italian political culture or familiarity, or if you call it mafia influence, like you can name a number of things that might have caused it, or a north-south divide. But for some reason, corruption is less of a thing there than it is in the
Yes.
Netherlands. So I don't think it
Mm-hmm.
has anything to do with like a right-wing government, or we had a social democratic government and we got less corrupt because there were more government people looking at corruption. Like I wish it was true, because then a lot of the big countries wouldn't have any corruption, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not true. Like we have a lot of corruption in the Netherlands. Maybe we're still top 10. Like, sure, I'll trust the numbers on that, but
Mm-hmm.
it has more to do with Dutch culture and how that developed, I think, than with the government structure by definition. I'm
Yeah.
not saying there are zero incentives involved, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel it's more of a cultural issue, and that's why most of the messed up countries have a lot of corruption.
Yeah. What I would say there is that, well, I think it's entirely possible that the extent to which there is, government corruption and so on, largely does have to do with culture.
Mhm.
I would say that I think like two things can be true at once, right? Like it can be true that bigger government and more taxation, more social spending has a causal impact on a decrease in government corruption, and it can also be true that better culture also has that impact. I think those things both probably are true. But I don't think that you can explain like all of the data that exists purely by appealing to culture. So like, for example, one thing that I like to do when there's like a data set and it's compatible with two different theories, right? Like the data that I've provided is compatible with the idea that this is just a spurious correlation and the underlying thing there is culture. It's also compatible with the idea that there is a negative impact, or there's a positive impact of government size on corruption. I think the data here is probably more compatible with my theory in the sense that like if it were true that it's all because of culture, it would just have to be sort of a coincidence that all the countries with bigger governments also tend to coincidentally have like better cultures. When what I'm saying is that I think government size has a positive impact on the culture in this sense, and that like when more of people's money is being taxed and spent by the government, the culture more so incentivizes and normalizes people like being more invested in what the government does with their money, to make sure that there's not corruption going on and so on.
Okay, okay. If
Yeah.
I could give an example, like
Mm-hmm.
now you have government roads, right?
Mhm.
In a free market society, you would have a lot of private roads. You would
Mhm.
have to pay the people to access their private roads. That would not be considered corruption in that free market society. It would be considered a payment.
Mhm.
If you live in a messed up country where police could stop you at any time and you have to pay a couple of dollars to get to a certain road, we would call that corruption. So the one is like documented because it's a government thing. And then if they don't do it, we could say, hey, we solved corruption. But if you would have left to the free market, there would just be a guy making a few dollars and there would have been no victims and you wouldn't even need to research it. It would have just been a great allocation of goods. A guy has a road, built a road, wants to make some money off it, people want to use it. You don't even have to talk about the law.
Mhm.
So like you're creating the own problems you're solving almost, right? We're like, if we put a guy on every street corner and we make sure none of them rob citizens, we solved corruption, right? Like I'm making a caricature, but you get where I'm going with this. Like
Yeah.
you
So
cannot discount like that like turning of the tables, right? If you would have made it a free market, things we call corruption now wouldn't be corruption because there would have been no corrupt incentives to begin with. It would have been just an honest trade.
yeah. So is the point you're making that you think that like the corruption sort of measures that I'm talking about are flawed because they like I guess assume a government like in the first place?
Yeah, because let's say liquor licenses, right? So
Mhm.
you can research and say, listen, we found that only 10 guys who give out liquor licenses took out some bribes last year, and it was 110 years ago. So we solved corruption by 90%. But in a free market, there would probably be private, brands promoting liquor licenses or saying this liquor license is sponsored by Heineken. And, it would be like a reputation thing. And if you then give liquor to 16-year-old kids, Heineken will like fire your ass and put you out
Mhm.
and expose you and say, these guys are giving kids alcohol. So Heineken has its own guys checking the thing. And Heineken has its own, obviously, corruption index or whatever, but it's just part of the job for them. So then we wouldn't even need to measure it if you would believe that the free market could regulate not selling alcohol to kids, for instance.
Yeah, so I guess sort of like I guess 2 points
Hmm.
there that I would make. I think that so like when it comes to like the corruption, at least like the Transparency International Index that I was referencing
Yeah.
sort of defines corruption as just like the abuse of like entrusted power for like private gain, right?
Ah, okay.
And it would seem that like like in a libertarian society, at least in the way that like Ayn Rand visioned it, there would still
Yeah.
sort of like be a government. And I guess what I'm saying is that, if an argument that, you would make is that if you have the government spending more, the government's going to get larger, it's going to have, more potential for corruption. And, as you said, a libertarian society would have more political freedoms, just aside from like the economic
Yeah.
stuff. I would think that it seems that like the data would suggest, and like, my sort of argument from people wanting to pay more attention to what the government's doing if the government has more of their money. I think this would suggest that in a society where the government stays out of the economy, there we don't have any reason to think that there would be more like political reasons, political freedom apart from the economy, as opposed to a place where the government is heavily involved in the economy. Um, and like I guess I agree that like in a free market society, there would technically be no corruption in terms of like there would be no government corruption in the economy because the
Mhm.
government like wouldn't be in the economy.
Yeah.
Like yeah, I mean that's obviously true. Yeah, I would agree with that. The only thing that I would say is I think there would still be like I think there would still be like private corruption. It just wouldn't be classified as like government corruption. Or there would still be like negative outcomes
Could you
associated
give
with
me
like
an
the market
example of
functionalities.
could you give me an
Mhm.
example of private corruption?
Yeah, so I don't know if like corruption, but sort of like one problem that I have that I sort of mentioned earlier is the inability of capitalism to like internalize externalities, which I don't know if you would consider that, corruption if people are doing things which are antithetical to the interests of society at large for private profit. It just depends on how you define corruption. Ultimately, I think it's like a semantic game. But like, so for example, one reason that capitalists don't decide to provide high-speed internet to rural communities is because even though doing this would, help a lot of people very substantially, it's not profitable because, rural communities don't have high enough like population density. Like another reason why a lot of the reason why people argue there needs to be like a government involvement in like healthcare is because like one thing that private healthcare companies would be incentivized to do is like not allow people with pre-existing conditions on their healthcare plans, because it would be like a drain on their resources. So fundamentally what I'm getting at is there are costs to society associated with every economic decision, and there are benefits to society associated with the economic decision. But when we leave this decision to be made by private hands, like private companies, the problem is not all of the costs that accrue to society accrue to the companies themselves, and not all of the benefits that a potential action would provide to society accrue to the companies themselves. Because like fundamentally, if a company gives someone healthcare and it makes them happy, that's great. It's a benefit to society, but that doesn't show up as revenue in monetary terms, like for the company. So like, yeah, I guess that's what I'd say.
Okay, but that still would be like a cultural debate, right? I mean, let's say you're talking about these rural areas. So you don't think if like Budweiser would say, listen, we can front the bill for these people. Like if you need $100,000 more to put an internet department over there, we'll pay for it. You don't think that a company could like make money or like branding by saying we're going to sponsor internet for this rural area, and maybe they sell beers and maybe they sell the beers in that area, or maybe they can promote it as a political thing or virtue signal on it. Like they could do whatever the hell they want with it. But you don't see how there's like a market incentive, especially in the world of today, like where being social or helping people, either way you want to define it, even if it's with like a selfish goal at the end of it, like I just see that as that would be priced in. Like that's priced in. Like big companies would want to do that. Like it looks very good. Like people like that. So like I'm not that worried. I'm not gonna say that big companies are gonna solve every little evil in the world. But if you're talking about things like more internet or more buses to rural areas, I really think those are areas where the market could quite easily jump in. If you're talking about, handicapped people, it's a little bit more difficult and more precise. But I think these major issues are very attractive for big companies or unions or whatever to, make a big branding for themselves. Even.
Yeah, so I would say that there is certainly some areas in which this would be the case, right? Like one thing is like we've seen a lot of companies, maybe promoting like social justice causes or things like that, because they think it's profitable. It's like good PR. The question is, the problem is like every company when they do this sort of thing, like asks a question, like, is the potential benefits from PR going to outweigh the costs of just doing the thing? And so I would say in a lot of these cases, like for example, like providing high-speed internet to rural communities, I think these things would be like massively expensive in a way that wouldn't be outweighed by any potential like PR gains. And evidently the companies themselves have made this same calculation that I've made, because they haven't done it yet, right? And so I think that having like interventions, so like one thing that I advocate for is a social wealth fund, where the government is sort of is a shareholder in companies in the economy and sort of guides what the company does. And one of the good things about that is that the government is directly incentivized to internalize externalities in a way that companies aren't. And I just think like having the involvement there of like a government which directly is impacted by sort of the broader interests of society in ways that companies are more, narrowly just driven by private profit. I think this is a much more like effective way of internalizing externalities than just hoping that some company decides that makes the calculation that it would be better in terms of PR to do this thing.
Okay, I got a few points. I think it's unfair competition for the government to participate in some companies. Like I think either go all the way and be full socialist or leave it alone. Like if you go halfway, it really messes up the incentives, and I think that's really a breeding ground for corruption. The second point I wanted to make is it's not really fair to say these companies must have calculated this because they're not doing this, because you're discounting the government. You're discounting the role of government. So for instance, in Amsterdam, we don't have high-speed internet in like the inner city if you're just walking around with your phone. Like some cities have that. Like in Germany, some cities, there's like Wi-Fi all over the city. It's like government sponsored. Some cities, there are private actors doing it. Amsterdam is in between. They talk about doing it perhaps, but they don't do it. So all the companies are sitting around like, yeah, why would I be the first guy to jump in? Like if I go in now and then government is like, hey, great idea you have right there. Let's do it in all of the city. I lost all the incentive. So in a way, the government being there and threatening to do stuff and talking about doing stuff could be something that halts innovation altogether. Because either as a company, you're going to wait till you can join some public private stuff and you can get some government money. There we come again with the corruption. Or you're just waiting because you don't want to take the risk of putting in 100 million and then the government to come in after 2 years and be like, hey, great idea you have there. Let's take it over, get your 100 million back, no profit for you. Like, do you see that side of the coin? Like that reasoning for a company to be like, why would I be the first? I'm not crazy. I'm not going to take that risk. Let another company do it. Let the government do it. They've been talking about it for years.
Yeah. I guess in terms of like, am I like discounting the government? I would say that it's possible that there are certain companies that, well, I feel like in almost in terms of like your hypothetical,
Mm-hmm.
it seems that, even if a company thinks, a government might step in and do this thing after I've started doing it,
Mm-hmm.
even if that's sort of the thought process, it seems like your argument is that the reason companies would benefit from this is because of like PR. And it almost seems like if a company did this thing and everyone was like, hey, that's really cool that this company did this. And then the government, later in, you stepped in and started doing it themselves. I think fundamentally the benefits of the PR would still be there in that scenario. So I'm not sure why the government's potential involvement would sort of
Well,
prevent private companies from doing
in
that.
this
And
case, I was talking about internet in like the inner city of Amsterdam. So like you could make some money off of it. I wasn't talking about like sponsoring a rural area. There, I would more tend to agree with you. Like
oh,
probably
okay.
the company that wanted to do Amsterdam City, they wanted to like advertise and like I don't know, you can get half an hour of free internet. I don't know what they wanted to do with it, but they would have to put in quite a lot of money to start doing that for Amsterdam. And
Mhm.
they look at other countries and they see, well, in the one country government does it, and in the other country they let private companies do it. But because I know the government is so heavily involved in the economy and this idea pops up every year, I'm just not going to take the innovative risk of putting like 100 people on the staff team and for 3 years. And then, it would have been almost for nothing. We might get some good press out of it and some legal cases or stuff, but that's not
Mhm.
what you're looking for as a company, right? So I'm not saying this applies in every case, but that's why I come back to the seen and the unseen, because that's one thing I keep thinking about when I hear, socialists talk about economic reforms. And if we just switch this money and if we just take the money from here and put it into there, I just don't think it works like that. And that's why I bring in the seen and the unseen, because like honestly, if I was one of those big companies, yeah, I wouldn't do it. Or I probably wouldn't take the risk. But let's imagine the other situation. Let's say the government says, you know what? We're not getting involved. This is one area, the market, you can handle it. A lot of people want internet. People are prepared to pay for internet. This is really something we have nothing to do with. That immediately either people would sign petitions asking companies to jump in, or like something would happen, right? People would say, okay, this is like a $300 million market if you charge everyone €1 each day to go on the internet in Amsterdam City. Like, that it wouldn't be like they wouldn't leave it alone, right? Like companies would jump into it, right?
So
If the
my the
government would explicitly say, we're not getting involved, you guys handle this. This is not a product that is scarce. You guys have all the technology. You know more about internet than us. We're just a bunch of bureaucrats. Please, for the love of God, fix this one issue. You don't
so
think they would immediately jump in?
I mean, it depends, right? Like I feel like like
We're talking about
the,
Amsterdam, right? Not like a
oh
backward
sure.
area.
So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
I don't know. I don't know about Amsterdam. Like
yeah. But come
I've
on, like
well, I
reasonably.
don't. I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't know anything about like the internet policy in Amsterdam. What I was more so saying is like because I don't even know anything about like the population density of Amsterdam.
It's
What
a
I
million.
was
It's a million.
sure,
1.5 with the area
sure,
around it. Yeah,
yeah.
big for
I
the
was more
Netherlands.
so
Yeah.
I was more so appealing to places where like there's not enough people where providing internet there would be profitable to companies. Um, so like
But we
yeah,
could
that's sort of
isolate
like
those
what
two
I was referring.
discussions. Like we could isolate those two. But I just want to
Mhm.
know, do you agree with me that in cities where people want internet and use it every day, then you would be okay with just letting the market do it? Because like we could then talk about the other example you
Mhm.
gave about people not getting it. Like because I get that side. But
Yeah.
could
So
we at
if
least agree that if the government would say we're not getting involved, definitely the market would jump in and there would be like an allocation of, you know, supply and demand. Like
yeah, in places where there is like enough people where it's profitable to provide internet there, I
yeah.
think that the like private companies would provide internet there. Now I would still support, the government being involved in some sort of an indirect fashion in terms of like having like shares in companies from like a social wealth fund. Just because fundamentally I think any market is going to make certain decisions. And I think having the government as an owner in that company, it more so makes it likely that the way that company acts is going to reflect the broader interest of society rather than the more narrow, profit incentive of the individual company that, typical shareholders have.
Would you like to address
I would,
the unfair competition remark? Because you said this before, and then I said it's unfair competition because what about all the other companies that the government isn't helping? So are you proposing that the government invest in every company in the country, like by a rule, or
well, mhm.
because that would be more fair? Like I think it's worse, but it would at least be equal to everyone.
Yeah, so I think that like it just depends on like what stage we're talking about. So like I wouldn't say that like a social wealth fund should invest in every single company in the economy like immediately.
Mhm.
I think that like a social wealth fund should probably like if it wants to get involved in like, starting to have like more of an impact on the economy, maybe start with like larger companies, start with like Walmart or like, General Motors if it wants to get involved in like that kind of thing. Um,
But I think
so
if
yeah.
you're doing this, like you're making the same mistakes because now you're also establishing who gets to get government involvement. So then the guy who is smaller than Chrysler but is still selling cars, he's not going to get this government guidance that you think is good. I think it's terrible, but you think it's good. So this guy is not going to get government guidance and like wisdom, but the bigger companies are. So if you're against poverty and you're a socialist, wouldn't that be against your ideals?
I
Because it
don't
would feel
think
like the
mhm.
government is helping the better off.
Yeah, I don't think that I don't think that having a government as a partial shareholder in a company is necessarily a competitive advantage for that company. I think it's more so just like making sure that that company is like the revenues that accrue to that company go more broadly to society, and making sure that the actions of that company are in more so in the interest of society than just in the private interest of certain shareholders.
But, would,
Um,
but wouldn't you agree that given that the government, even though they have a monopoly on violence, it's still not a one-way street? Like if the government is involved with like Heineken or something, or like a real big company, like it's not like the government can dictate everything, right? Like the company is going to be like, hey, there's a certain point that we're just going to quit and we employ 80,000 people, so you don't want that problem, government, so you're going to give us something. So there would be some compromise between the wants of the company and the government. So I cannot imagine it not being an advantage if the government is so involved in all of the economy. Like if the government
yeah,
would be standoffish, maybe then you would have, it would still be unfair, but there would be more of a point. But I don't know, man. I don't really see how you can rhyme these two things with each other. Like,
yeah. So like I think that if your point is that like um I guess like the point is like the government and the private a
They
company
would
would
have to
have
make
to
a
like
deal. Like
negotiate in some way. Yeah, yeah, sure,
yeah.
sure. I would say that if I mean if it would only be like in the same sense that a company would have to negotiate with any other shareholder, right? Like it would just be like the government owns shares in a company. Preferably, it would be like the majority or like the entire shareholder. So basically, like whatever the company votes on in terms of like a board of directors, whatever the company says, shareholder meetings, like you have to do this or you have to do this. It would sort of be like the same relationship there.
I think there's one crucial difference, and that is the nature of politics. So
Mhm.
if a company had to negotiate with a shareholder, he would probably look at money and perhaps reputation, depending on the status of that person. If you're talking about a government, you're talking about a cabinet or a president that could fall or not fall, have a majority or not. There could be a lot of other political things, even wars involved. So I think that is a dimension that is so alien to the economy that the moment you mix those two, because the people who represent the government are going to represent way more than just looking at the numbers. They're going to be like, if you go bankrupt right now, we might lose an election and we might lose the war against Iran, right? So like that is a stake way bigger than like a major investor. We're talking about world wars literally, right? So I
Mhm.
think the moment companies and government have to make deals on that level, like you cannot expect there not to be corruption. Like it's almost inevitable that either the government is going to strong on them, or either the company is going to bribe people who work for the government, or the government is going to let them pay slave wages because it's one of the big companies and they need them for the support because the guys who work for them have to vote for me, right? Do you see
Mhm.
like the negative incentive that a shareholder wouldn't have? He would probably only look at money and maybe reputation.
Yeah.
Probably
So
money.
yeah, yeah. So I think like the point fundamentally that you're making is that the government has a different incentive from a
Yeah.
regular shareholder, and that incentive has to do with different political actors like popularity. Um, but I think that's almost just a different way of saying what I was saying, and I think that's like a good thing, right?
Mhm.
Like I think like having a shareholder that is fundamentally, because when you say they're interested in popularity like a politician, what you fundamentally mean is that politicians are going to be incentivized to do things that make sort of the democratic populace of the society happy, and like makes them pleased with their decisions. And so that's when I say like having the government be a shareholder in a company allows that company to act more so in the interests of like broader society. That's kind of like what I'm saying, and I
Ooh,
just think
like
that's like a good thing, right?
okay. I think it's really nice how you turn that into your corner, because I do see the point you're making. Like
Mm-hmm.
there could be issues where like the government would look at female rights because they know that's a popular issue with the people, and you and I might say, yeah, well, that's actually good because we don't want females to be like oppressed or whatever. What
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about is we have a president who is working on a war with Iran, and at the same time, this company is saying, listen, we're not going to take any more minimum wage hikes. Like we've been bending our backs for you guys. We're just going to unplug the whole company, screw you guys. And them telling them, hold up, hold up. We got a war coming up. We ain't got time for this. That's what I'm more talking about. I'm not talking about some honest ideal of a congressman advocating for like the oppressed people who work for that company, what you're talking about. I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking about there are bigger things involved here. Shut up. We can't have you going bankrupt right now. You understand me?
So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I think even in your example, wouldn't that still be like a positive? Like if the government is preventing a company going bankrupt because that company going bankrupt would like make it harder for the country to like deal for an upcoming war. I would think that's another example of like the government being a positive influence on the incentives of that company,
Okay,
right?
but this would only apply if your assumption would be that the government would be fully right and correct. Like that would have to be your assumption. And to me,
Which assumption?
that the government is right in their policies, that the war is
Mhm.
correct, that everything would have to be fully correct, and then your argument could slide. But if only one thing is not correct, let's say the war is not correct, or the information about the war is not correct, or they're trying to pressure one guy into voting for a war who doesn't want to vote for it, but he thinks that the company is for it. Like,
Mhm.
I don't think it's like a fairy tale story where, all of the people want to go to war and this one company wants to stop the war. Like, I think there's
Mhm.
way more chance of just real underhanded deals taking place to conserve power. And that would be like a major misgiving for me. But I think it's interesting thought. Like, honestly, it's something we could discuss maybe some other time. Maybe you want to think about this a little bit. I thought it was like quite an
Y-
exciting.
Yeah, I think yeah, so I guess like the last thing I would say on
Sure.
that point is I think that, fundamentally my argument, so like a social wealth fund, the incentives of the government on a company are only going to be a positive when the government is correct.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Yeah.
similarly, I think that the same would apply to any private shareholder, that, whether or not the decisions that a private shareholder makes as opposed to, the government being a shareholder is only going to be good if that private shareholder is also correct. So I think this sort of applies both ways. But I would say the question is,
Yeah.
which entity, a private shareholder or the government, generally speaking, has better incentives? And I would say that I think the government generally has better incentives in terms of this, because, like I said, the government is more incentivized to care about the costs that accrue more broadly to society, as opposed to just the profit margins of that
Yeah.
company,
So
as opposed to a private
yeah,
one. Yeah.
I would counter that by making the Ayn Rand point that if a bureaucrat makes a mistake, or that if like an investor makes a mistake, he's gonna suffer for it. The people who work for him, his family is gonna suffer, but usually not everyone. But if there's a war involved or like pension funds of 17 million Dutch people involved, and a bureaucrat makes a mistake or takes a wrong bribe, everyone is screwed. So, but
Well,
yeah, I get where you're
and
coming from. Yeah.
in this example though, the reason that, the shareholder making mistake would be less bad than, the government make. So if I could be misunderstanding your point,
No, no, no.
but the reason, what it seems like you're saying is that a government making a bigger mistake is worse than a private shareholder making a bigger mistake, because if, the government makes a mistake and goes to war, the implications of that are going to be much worse than a shareholder, because the shareholder like has like less institutional power, and sort of in that sense. But it would seem like in this instance, we're specifically talking about the effects of the government if we make the government a shareholder in companies. So whether or not the government makes a bad decision as a shareholder in a company is going to have the same exact implications as if a private shareholder makes a mistake in a company. Those two things would have the exact same effect or the exact same influence. But it seems like you're almost, I feel like equivocating, that might be like too harsh. It almost seems like we're equivocating like the government as a shareholder and like the government in general, where like I agree with you that in general the
Okay.
government like making mistake would be worse than any ordinary shareholder making mistake. But
Okay.
if we're specifically talking about a social wealth fund, I think the government as a shareholder making mistake could only be as bad as a private shareholder making a mistake. But I think the government, generally speaking, has better incentives and is more likely to make better decisions that take more into account the interests of
That,
society.
yeah, that's a good point you made, because my quote was actually about government in general. So it's
Mhm.
fine of you to point that out.
Mhm.
Okay, I think this has been interesting. I don't want to make it too long.
Yeah,
Just
sure.
what my viewers think of it. If they want more of it, maybe I'll let you know, right? I'll tell you
Yeah,
how they
sure.
respond to you.